So welcome. I'm here today with Professor Doug Rogers. Doug is a professor of anthropology at Yale who specializes in political and economic anthropology. His fieldwork has been in Russia. He's the author of 2 books on Russia, focusing on economic matters and most recently on the oil industry there. He can correct me, but I believe this is the route that got him to his current thinking about capitalism, about corporations, and about all of the kinds of customs and behaviors that encrust around those formations. Welcome, Doug. Is there anything you want to add about your work and your thinking?
Thank you, Matt. It's a pleasure to be with you, even if not in actual person.
So let us start just in a general way. I know that you're teaching a course on capitalism right now, and you recently have taught a course on corporations. Can you just talk a little bit about the contours of these courses, what it is that you hope to get across, what's important about corporation and capitalism as objects of study, and what are the things that you're most trying to get across to your students in these settings?
Both of these classes, but especially the class that I'm teaching now, which is called Anthropological Approaches to Capitalism, are meant to provide some new ways for students to think about capitalism. And I guess rather than with capitalism, let me start with anthropology, because my approach in these classes is very much tied up in my background as a cultural anthropologist, as someone who studies political or economic or social cultural systems from the perspective of people's everyday lives. So not starting from particular sort of economic theories of the world or political theories of the world, but what is going on in people's lives? How does the world emerge when you talk to people or live with people in various times and places? And as you mentioned, I've spent a lot of time living in Russia over the past 20, 25 years, where everybody has been getting used to this new thing for them called capitalism. So it was as Russians encountered capitalism after the communist period that I got to also encounter capitalism in a very different way than I knew it myself. And the spirit of a course on the anthropology of capitalism follows this general insight that capitalism is different in different places, that there's a great deal of value in exploring those differences and how they appear to people in everyday life. So often things like capitalism or other big categories of our lives just appear as the way the world works. They appear natural. They appear just to what people do or what we do all the time. Most anthropologists would say that that's a mistake to think of these things as natural or universal. That careful historical or anthropological study reveals a lot of interesting things about something like capitalism, about the ways in which if we stop and look at these routines or these habits or these practices, some new insights emerge into how they work that are quite different from the kinds of insights one gets in an introduction to economics class, say, where you're sort of already beginning with a set of assumptions or a set of definitions. So these classes are meant to sort of question the idea that there is an easily identifiable universal capitalism. Think, well, what if we were to just not assume that it was natural or universal? And what if we were to assume, furthermore, that we could, by attending very carefully to our own lives, through doing ethnography, which is sort of anthropology's main research method, ethnography, ethno for people and graphy for writing, so just writing about people, that we could come up with some new insights about how capitalism works or doesn't. So that's the general goal. I mean, in the actual class, we spend about the first half of the class reading about capitalism in different times and places and with different kinds of approaches. And in the second half, the focus shifts to actually students doing their own ethnographic projects, where they're doing interviews in New Haven on topics of their choice that are somehow about capitalism, where they're talking to people, understanding their perspectives on the world, whether that be labor or money or exchange or power, and then writing that up. So it's a little bit of reading and then a bit of doing.
That's great. I want to back up a minute, back to Eastern Europe for a second, because the upheavals in Eastern Europe really starting in the 90s and this amazing shift in that part of the world. I was studying Poland at the time after the wall came down, and one of the things that just kind of seared a certain kind of image in my own thinking was the shock as it was experienced in Poland was from a system where everybody had a job or a post, but nobody had goods, to a system where there were going to be goods all over the place, but employment was going to be completely uncertain. And in fact, everything was going to be completely uncertain. I mean, that's just a fundamental transformation to go through. So I'm just wondering what you observed as you were studying that shift in Russia, and what are some of the lessons to be learned about capitalism as a formation? What are some of the things that you might not get about capitalism unless you're looking at that part of the world?
I think that's an excellent question. So 1991, the year I started college, was the end of the Soviet Union. 1989 had been the sort of unraveling of communism in Eastern Europe. And it was the entire transformation of that part of the world was so compelling that sort of set me on my path of wanting to learn Russian and become an anthropologist and understand this part of the world. And I rapidly found myself, as I was in college and then in graduate school, talking to people about precisely these kinds of experiences that you're mentioning, where all of a sudden people are dealing with unemployment. All of a sudden people are dealing with the fact that all these consumer goods pouring in from the West, you could buy anything you want, but all of a sudden you didn't have any money to buy those things. Inflation, pyramid schemes, barter, all of these sort of things that we don't actually, many of us don't have concrete experiences of, were suddenly everyday life for people. And for companies or for businesses too. You know, it was not just people who were sort of bartering, but companies. I remember very well in the early 1990s being in Moscow and being able to just walk through large sections of the city where people would be standing on street corners selling whatever they had in these huge street corner markets. So all of those things were just so formative for the people I came to know in Russia. Those experiences of what they sometimes call wild capitalism. But they were also very clearly not what sort of Western advisors and economists and consultants thought was going to happen in the 1990s. I mean, the idea among the international academic and consulting crowd was that communism would end and capitalism, being the sort of natural way that humans organize the world, will suddenly spring forth fully formed, and you will have markets and you will have democracy and everything will work beautifully and people's lives will improve. And they didn't happen in Russia or in Poland or in any of these Soviet countries. Lives improved for some people. You had certainly the rise of what's sometimes called the oligarch class very quickly, and you got massive amounts of inequality. But for most people, by the time I'm there in graduate school for a year and a half to do my substantive fieldwork, people were pretty convinced that capitalism hadn't really helped most of them at all, especially the people that I was talking to in rural areas.
So in a place like Russia, is the through line from the collapse of the old Soviet system to the rise of the oligarchs, is that in some sense just a reimposition of power in new forms by the old ruling class? Or is it something that is specific to the kinds of capitalist exploitation that were suddenly available starting in the 90s?
I think it's a little bit of both. There was certainly a way in which if you were a member of the Communist Party and fairly well placed, the 1990s afforded you a lot of ways in which to remake yourself as a capitalist pretty quickly. And you already had a head start. You had the inside connections. You maybe had a way to influence the law. Particularly, you might have had a way to influence the privatization process. So as things went from state property to private property, many of the people who got a head start in that were former regime leaders.
Well, and the apparatchiks too, right?
Yes, and the apparatchik.
I was in Warsaw in like 95 or 96, and somebody was joking to me there that we used to have the Communist Party, now we have Pepsi-Cola. The Communist Party had just moved into this one corporation that now was dominating Warsaw.
Yes, that's right. But notice too that is also a difference in that it is a consumer goods branding kind of company, right? Pepsi-Cola is not the Lenin Steelworks or whatever the previous big employer was. So this is where there's some differences as well, is that you begin to see different sectors of the political and economic world become more important. So classically, first, as you point out, consumer goods, all these, suddenly instead of, 4 different choices of something to drink, you have 1 million of them. But in Russia over the 1990s, the real issue has been oil, which was significant to the Soviet Union, of course, but not in a capitalist way. It wasn't, the Soviet Union was a major world exporter of oil, but it never sort of functioned in the Soviet economy in the way it does in Western economies. There was never any Soviet oil boom towns. It wasn't a very prestigious industry. They never controlled access to political power in the way that you see frequently in capitalist countries. But suddenly it became a very big thing. in the 1990s and into the 2000s in Russia. So you do find some old folks, old apparatchiks, old party members moving into new areas of power, but also new areas of economic life becoming suddenly important in ways that they never were before. So oil in the Soviet Union, consumption and consumer goods everywhere. So those two transformations at the same time, and they're sort of, the ways they get tangled up seem to me quite very much the story of the 1990s.
Can you talk a little bit about your generational observations as you teach this material to a rising group of students who actually have known nothing but crisis through much of their adult lives, right? Are they particularly ready or particularly unready to hear what you have to say about capitalism?
Well, it's funny, I thought you were going to say, instead of they've known nothing but crisis, they haven't actually known socialism, which is actually where we start the class. Because I have a much easier time teaching some of this stuff to people of an older generation who remember, there was the Soviet Union and it was a different way you could organize the economy. And I would say there's actually two pieces to teaching this current generation. So the students in this class are born in 1999 or so, 2000. And they, have no active memory of different organization of political economy. They don't have a memory of the Soviet Union and socialism. On the other hand, they have very significant memories of, as you point out, cascading capitalist crises in which we now find ourselves. Another one, I've taught this course, in one version or another for 10 or 15 years, and there is a very interesting cyclical thing where the closer we are to a capitalist crisis, the easier it is to convince students that capitalism is not a natural or universal way of organizing the world. This is not surprising. The students are in the same place as all of us in this case. But many of the things I try to get across in the course, and that I mentioned at the beginning of our conversation about capitalism changes. It's different. You have to pay attention to everyday life, and everyday life shows you interesting things. In a crisis, that becomes very obvious to all of us, very dramatically now, quite dramatically about 10 years ago. And I suddenly found when teaching that course about 10 years ago that, all the time I devoted at the beginning of the class to a big sort of, hey, capitalism is not necessarily universal. It's not necessarily to be sort of taken for granted. It's not always the same. Like I did this whole big lecture on it and everybody looked at me like, am I really going to take this class? Is this what we're going to learn? Of course, obviously. But even 2 years earlier, I had to really work to get across that basic point.
No, it's interesting. So in the 18th and 19th century, it was a common argument, but also a relatively easy argument to make that capitalism would be the most fitting soil for true democracy to flourish. That argument becomes increasingly difficult to make through the 20th century, and it's almost impossible, at least as far as I'm concerned, to make it with a straight face in the 21st century. Where do you think your students are in their understanding of the relationship between capitalism and democracy?
It's a good question. I think that they are skeptical of it. There's a lot, so these days there's a lot of interest in whether one or another version of socialism, which is not the same socialism as the Soviet or the Polish version that we talked about at the beginning, is a compelling alternative. And that's frequently framed by the students as, would it be more democratic? Could there be a democratic socialism that would be some kind of an alternative to capitalism in the present moment? That's, a lot of students sort of frame that as the reason they take the class, is thinking about that, because I think they are, many of them, skeptical of whether the current configuration of capitalism that we see, at least in this country, is very compatible with democracy. Part of the goal of the course is to get them to think outside the context of this country as well. So it's also the case that capitalism and democracy might be configured very differently elsewhere. And one might want to think about that. But at this global moment, we're not at a strong point for capitalism and democracy, I think it's fair to say.
So speaking of this moment, your course took a surprising turn long about spring break. Suddenly, your students are in diaspora. They're scattered, I imagine, not just all over the country, but all over the world at this point.
That's true. And let me say, not one of them, despite all sorts of difficulties in their homes, in their home countries, where not one of them has yet missed a class, which is a real testament to their dedication and hard work.
That's great. Well, I imagine that they're learning all sorts of things that neither you nor they could have imagined them learning as you set out at the beginning of the semester. I've been teaching long enough that I've had all kinds of moments like this where it's suddenly like, we invade Iraq, or there's a local strike at Yale, or there's, anything can happen. And suddenly it's like, okay, I guess we're throwing away the syllabus and we're doing something different here.
Yeah.
It can be, one obviously doesn't wish for these things, but it can be a really exciting time to teach. Can you talk a little bit about, the question I want to ask you is, what does the pandemic teach? What are the things that are revealed about capitalism that are very easy to see now that maybe they were more difficult to see 2 months ago?
Yeah, I mean, it's something I've thought a lot about, and the students have as well. The one that keeps coming up for me and the students is how artificial in the moment of crisis this thing called the economy actually appears to be. I mean, so for weeks we've been reading in the course before, there was this pandemic. We've been reading about the ways in which one might want to be skeptical of a notion of the economy in big capital letters or quotation marks or whatever marks it off as a thing that's out there and is identifiable, and that economists and politicians would tell you was sort of the sum of monetary exchanges within particular borders or within the world, right? So there's the Connecticut economy and the national economy and the global economy, right? You can just count this up.
Which is like a really modern idea.
It's a very modern idea. I mean, there's various sort of genealogies of how this came to be, but clearly it wasn't with us in this form before the middle of the 20th century. And even then it was a fairly minority view. It's sort of taken over everybody's imagination in recent times. But
is that a function of data collection? Like, is it the scope of our understanding, like GDP?
I would guess that broader historical things afoot that sort of launched this concept, but it was totally grown up with this idea of big data, that you could measure it, that the economy was a thing that could be counted and measured because it's basically tracking monetary exchanges. And if you look hard enough, and if you come up with the right data tools for both collection and analysis, you can slice it and dice it in 1,000 different ways and say something about it. But the massive disruptions of the crisis and the pandemic have made so clear how that's not really an adequate way of talking about what goes on that is economic activity. And you see this in domain after domain. I mean, one of them is this discourse between we have to save the economy or we have to take care of people's health. And that is openly being contested. So, like, the fact that the economy, like, you typically find in American discourse that kind of challenge to the notion of the economy. Everybody thinks it's somehow sacred. But very quickly, people came to challenge the sacredness of the economy as a particular kind of all-encompassing and all-governing concept. You see it in, everybody now working from home and juggling childcare and more traditional labor employment. Childcare is typically, it doesn't, work that parents do on reproductive labor, highly gendered category, it doesn't fall into typical notions of the economy. You don't count the work that you do educating your children as part of the economy, but everyone's finding out that that's a hell of a lot of work, and it's really important, but that doesn't count in the economy. People are suddenly finding the ways in which all these things we take for granted about the economy, like the availability of toilet paper, are things that are very much in question in their own lives, and they're reading about, thinking about, talking about very sort of complex supply chain. Where does something come from, and where do I get it, and what are the relations behind that, in ways that are much more like what, in other times I have to teach students to do, or what anthropologists do, is think, how is that organized?
Right.
What is actually at the center of this thing called the economy? Yeah. We don't think about much of the time, but all of a sudden it turns out to be immigrants in meatpacking plants or
hospitals,
right? Or at hospitals who are, or in grocery stores or things like this. All of these things sort of expose the way in which our conventional understandings of the economy are actually put together. They're made up. They're not made up in the sense that they're fictional. They're very real, but they are made by humans and made consistently.
Yes. I mean, one of the things that's been really striking to me, and this is a lesson that one would have thought we had learned in 1929, but obviously we didn't, is that the aggregate data actually conceal at least as much as they reveal. And so as the economy seems to be humming along, 6 months ago, what is concealed is that roughly half of the population or more is living from paycheck to paycheck and is just like 1 week away from total household disaster and crisis. Same thing in 1929. The aggregate data for the 1920s looked pretty great. Suddenly, the mask was ripped off and the entire country was in crisis. And it feels like we're actually going through that exact scenario again, having learned nothing.
In so-called ordinary times, which we'll just let's just say 6 months ago, you had to look really hard to find people who were talking about the paycheck to paycheck nature of most people's work, or the lack of savings, or the ways in which all these other things fall outside of the economy, and including such basic things that are not all common, such as reproductive labor or gender division of labor, household labor. Like all these, those were places you had to look hard to find people studying them, and you never found them on TV or influencing the political process, or very rarely. But all of a sudden, yes, all those things suddenly reveal a massively different thing that everybody's struggling to figure out.
Can you talk a little bit about some of the work that your students are doing? Where are they? What are they finding? What kinds of projects are they taking on? How is the pandemic teaching them about capitalism?
Clearly, I had to abandon the idea of the final project where they work in groups of 3 or 4 and do interviews in New Haven, because none of them are here, and even if they were here, they couldn't talk to people. So I had to sort of rethink what this assignment was. And, I wanted to retain some of the interview flavor that's part of the skill of the class, is teaching, to have an interview style conversation about capitalism, but tailored to the quarantine routines of people all over the country and all over the world. Mm-hmm. So basically, the new assignment is to just do an interview with somebody who you are quarantined with or otherwise in your family about a topic of your choice. So it could be labor, it could be gender, it could be consumption, and their life in capitalism. So many students are interviewing parents or grandparents or sometimes friends. So I'm seeing a little bit of what their ideas are. I'll have to get back to you in a couple of weeks about what comes back. But a lot of the papers are focusing on kinship, on family, on intergenerational things within families and their experience of capitalism, and how parents or grandparents experienced capitalism quite differently. So I think there's going to be a quite historical bent to some of these papers, in which they're doing some oral history of, there's people talking to their grandparents about what it was like in the mid-20th century. There's many people talking to parents who have immigrant experiences and immigrant stories in the US or elsewhere. And the idea there is both to think about how things have changed, but also I think many of them are finding their ways to approaches to capitalism that really tie it to notions of family, notions of love, notions of affect, notions of emotion, the way in which these things that appear not rational or somehow, according to many differents, outside of what you would think of as economy. Because if economy is just this sort of some transaction of money, it doesn't really matter who's transacting it. But it often does, because so much of capitalism takes place in this intergenerational exchange of care and love. So for many students, it is, what does it mean that their parents have saved up to send them to college so that they will have a different career? For many students, it's the ways in which they are supporting their parents by going to college now and planning to in the future. So it ties a lot of these, or my sense is that it wasn't my plan, but it's sort of the way it seems to be developing is a lot of people thinking about the ways in which capitalism is tied up with family and with generations and emotions. So large-scale historical changes into which family histories are sort of layered and to which they contribute.
It's interesting because I think it's a moment where the values of capitalism, if you could call them that, are really being laid bare. I mean, it's the ugliness of that debate over like, are we really saying that we just need to let grandma die in order to save the economy? I mean, it's a brutal national discussion that's taking place.
Yes.
The kind of core logic, the heartless logic of capitalism is laid bare in a way that it almost never is. As it's always, happy talk about the market taking care of everybody has always concealed the ugliest jagged edges of what capitalist values actually are.
Right. It's more important to defend a way of life. Like, I'd happily die to defend the American economy or the American way of life, right? I mean, it speaks both to the heartlessness of the system, but also to the ways in which it's impossible for me to comprehend it. But there's a lot of heart in that statement. There's a lot of emotion invested in that attachment to a particular understanding of what life is that speaks to how intense that attachment to the everyday and to a particular way of being is that it makes a lot of sense for somebody with genuine emotion to say, I'm willing to die for the ability to buy stuff and be out there buying things and doing capitalism. That's some of that you see in that sort of extreme version of the way in which these notions of capitalism become so universalized and so sort of deeply embedded in people's understandings of who they are that it becomes very hard for us to step out of them.
I was really struck by your use of the word love in talking about your students and the kinds of things they're thinking about, because one of the things that I think is easier to see now than it was 6 months ago is that there are a lot of things that we hold dearly as kind of private values that we actually enact in spite of capitalism and not with its aid. I'm wondering if that's something that you think your students are discovering in their conversations with parents and grandparents.
I expect that's going to be some of what I find in this understanding that many of our interactions with family members or with neighbors or with healthcare workers or whatever are based on kinds of emotions or connections or social and cultural values, community values that don't easily fit with most definitions of capitalism or the economy. And then the question becomes, what if you were to sort of actually believe that those were the real things and not something to be papered over by a massive notion of the economy or capitalism? And what if you were to try to actually build a social or cultural or political or economic order on the basis of those kinds of connections and those kinds of ties? Where would that lead?
So I guess I don't want to ask you the typical, are you optimistic or pessimistic? But a version of it is, from where we're sitting right now, I do see that there's a fork in the road, and it's very, very easy to imagine a totally dystopic future. It is also, though, increasingly easy to imagine that this experience of collectivity around flattening the curve and around, all of the sacrifice and then the heroism of everyday life in this circumstance, that maybe it's heartening to think that the collective experience of the Great Depression is what gave us a vision of collectivity and governance that ruled for the next generation or two. And this could be a similar defining moment. How do you think about that? How do you think about what's lying ahead for us?
The same thoughts have occurred to me. I mean, it certainly seems that the doors of possibility are thrown more widely open at this point than any, certainly in my life. Maybe not the case for others. I don't think that from this point anything is predetermined, but I think there are a great deal of hopeful possibilities in precisely the kinds of connections that are being made and the chains of thought that people are going through in this time to think about a more sort of equitable or different kind of order. I mean, we clearly know, I've been saying this to my students who have a similar version of this question, I'm not quite sure what's going to happen, but we know from studies of the past that this kind of disruption in public health, in governance and economics will bring big changes. That's going to happen. We're not snapping back to where we were 6 months ago. And what those are is very much open to question, but people are asking those questions in ways that are, at least for this country, very new. Many of my friends, I've been talking to some of my friends in Moscow and elsewhere in Russia who are also quarantined, and for them it recalls the 1990s, in fact, where standing in line for food, for sort of simultaneous political and economic and social disruption was the order of the day. But that's not a memory that people in the United States have in any visceral way, at least except unless you go back to people who were alive at a much earlier time. But I do think that there are tremendous possibilities through the kinds of connections and imaginations that are quite visibly floating around in all directions at the moment.
Well, since you are a Russia expert, I have to ask you one last question, which is, are you seeing the hand of Putin in some of the crazy conspiracy theories that are bouncing around in our country, and especially in the run-up to the election? There's just so much crazy out there. When people take to the streets in Michigan to protest the stay-at-home order, are they acting at the behest of Putin indirectly, or is this our own homegrown American crazy?
I think that the United States has enormous capacity to produce conspiracies, and all by itself. This has been my general take, not just on the more recent protests, but on the past, on the much more dramatic Russian intervention, or whatever we want to call it, in the past election, is that, to whatever extent Russia plays an active role in some of these things, and it's to some extent, I can't quantify it, but it's to some extent, Americans do an awfully good job at inviting it and providing fertile soil, and an awful lot of work at growing it themselves.
Well, thank you so much, Doug. This has been a really illuminating conversation, and I'm eager to hear what your students do with this moment as they're out there in the world learning about capitalism in crisis. It's been a real pleasure to talk to you today.
Thank you, Matt. It's been a great pleasure to speak with you as well. Stay healthy.
You too.